Now, I have to tell you that the 40-year journey of the Hebrew people ended much as it began, with the crossing of a body of water. Back when they emerged from the Red Sea, the Hebrew people were scattered and fleeing crowd, escaping slavery. But by the time they got to the Jordan River, they were crossing with confidence, knowing who they were. When they reached that Jordan River, the priests lifted up the Ark of the Covenant onto their shoulders, and as soon as their feet touched the water, that massive river began to pile up. It stopped the flow of the river, and those priests walked into the center of the river on dry land. And the people marched on that dry ground straight into the promised land. But when they got there, they found people there. Now, I don't know about you, but this is one of the parts of the Old Testament that gets really challenging for me, especially given all the things that we have going on today with invasions and wars and then people coming in to try to take the land from others, people who are displaced and become refugees. But I think it's really important to remember that these stories are not about conquering in wars, not about God choosing one people over another people. But it's about God fulfilling promises, about God following through on the things that God says that God will do, and making of them a great people, a people who, as God said to Abraham, would be a light to the nations, who would bring God's blessing to all. Now, these Hebrew people, as they marched into the promised land, they were led by Joshua, who had been Moses' apprentice through much of the stories before. And Joshua, he was cunning and smart, and he talked with God and sent spies into that first big city that they encountered, a city named Jericho with monumental walls surrounding it. When those spies got into this city, they found a place where they could hide out, a place where they could explore and ask questions. It was the prostitute's house, run by a woman named Rahab. She had heard about God and had great respect for God and God's people. But when the king heard that there were spies in Jericho, he sent soldiers looking for them. And when the soldiers got to Rahab's house, she hid the spies on her roof under the thatch. She sent the soldiers off on a wild goose chase. And later on, when those same soldiers, the same spies would come back, when the people of God would come into Jericho, they cared for her and her family. And Rahab is not known as a woman of ill repute. She is not known as a prostitute. But in fact, Rahab finds her way into the genealogy of our holy Savior Jesus. They were faithful to her as she had been faithful to God. Now Joshua and the Hebrew people, they followed God's plan to take the city. They marched around those massive walls, one entire revolution around the city, one time each day for 6 full days, blowing their horns. On the 7th day, they marched not one time, but they marched 7 times around that city, blowing their trumpets with all the gusto and all the praise of God that they could muster. And then they blew a ram's horn and shouted, and those walls came falling down. Now, some people will say that all of that marching and the trumpets, they were covering the sound of engineers that the Hebrew people had sent under those walls so that they could remove the supports and make them collapse. And it doesn't really matter how it happened, but what we know is that God's plan worked. God works in a lot of different ways, but God fulfilled this promise too. This was only the beginning of the victories of the Hebrew people. They reclaimed much of the land that had been traveled by Abraham. And the descendants of Israel, that man who had been called Jacob, settled in different places, each in their lineage, and became the 12 tribes of Israel. But having lived in slavery and having lived wandering in the wilderness, now they had to learn how to rule, how to be a nation and to be a people. And so God would set before them judges to help them with administrating this land. And so that's the story that I'll share with you for tomorrow.